Hello. In this tasting, I want to round off my look at the wines of Jacob's Creek. I've been looking at half a dozen of those in commemoration of the fact that this year is the brand's 50th anniversary. So the wine I have here is the Sauvignon Blanc, the Classic Sauvignon Blanc, the 2025 vintage of that. And this is a variety that deserves looking at, because currently Sauvignon Blanc is widely recognised as the highest selling and most popular white grape variety, both by volume and value, in the Australian retail wine market, having overtaken Chardonnay, which had held that position for decades. Evidently, Sauvignon Blanc accounts for roughly 15% of all off-trade wine sales through retail currently in the Australian domestic market. Now, while it's the top-selling white grape variety, it's also true that a significant portion of the wines that are being sold there are actually produced in New Zealand. So one of the questions I should perhaps ask about the Jacob's Creek wine relates to its ability to compete with wines from Marlborough. So I'll be looking for that combination of tropical fruit flavours with a sort of a leaner, more herbaceous edge, and fruit characteristics such as passion fruit and asparagus. Now, the reason that I think that Jacob's Creek deserves to be celebrated at this stage in its development is the fact it's been a very important brand for the development of Australia's wine industry. It's built on the idea of being good value, and today the brand produces somewhere in the region of 6 million, maybe even up to 7 million cases of wine a year, something like about 75 million bottles, which are all produced at their winery in Rowland Flat, the southeastern end of the Barossa Valley. Now today, the Jacob's Creek wine portfolio is diverse. It comprises of about 30 individual wines defined either by their variety, their style, or possibly their blend. And that spans through about 10 different ranges related to different commercial tiers and some speciality collections. So the range starts with the entry-level varietal wines of the Classic label. Above that sit the Reserve range, which are regionally focused wines. They've produced the double barrel wines, where they've hit upon the idea of finishing rich styles of wines in spirit casks to add extra complexity of flavour. There's a range of sparkling wines. There's a range called unvined, which is de-alcoholised wines. There's a range called Le Petit, which I don't completely understand, and I haven't actually been able to find any in this market, which evidently are wines with a fresh Australian twist. As well as that, and that's why it's difficult to say exactly how many different ranges there are a number of heritage and limited release brands, which tend to be premium, they may be experimental, and they're certainly normally small batch wine. Now, Jacob's Creek traces its origins back to 1847, and that date is given on the label because that is the year that Johann Gramp and his family settled and started planting vineyards on the banks of Jacob's Creek. Also worth noting is that William Jacob, after whom the creek was named, settled here in 1840. He and his brother John, and later with his sister Anne, also planted vineyards, built a winery in the 1850s. Now, following William Jacob's death at the beginning of the 20th century, his winery and vineyards were then sold to the Gramp family and started contributing wines to the Orlando label. Orlando continued to be owned by the Gramp family until the 1970s, when in 1971 it was purchased by Reckitt and Coleman. It was in 1989 that Orlando and the Jacob's Creek brand were then purchased by Pernod Ricard, the French wine and spirits giant, as their first move into the Australian market. And then most recently, in April 2025, the wine arm of Pernod Ricard was merged with a company called Accolade to form a new global wine company called Vinarchy. And Vinarchy have brands both in Australia and New Zealand, also South Africa and Spain. Now, the Gramp family and the Orlando winery had a reputation for being innovative. In the 1950s, they were the first people to produce tank-fermented or Charmat method sparkling wines in Australia. And in the 60s, they became pioneers of cool fermentation for aromatic white wines. The innovative Jacob's Creek brand was launched under the ownership of Reckitt and Coleman in 1976. And within 4 years, what was initially known as Jacob's Creek Claret was Australia's top-selling red wine. By 1993, they were exporting 2 million cases of wine a year. Now, as far as this wine is concerned, it's actually difficult to see what its origins are in terms of where its fruit is sourced from. It's simply labelled as an Australian wine, although I believe fruit for this is broadly sourced from within the state of South Australia, although they don't say definitely that there is no fruit from elsewhere used in this wine. They talk about drawing on high quality vineyards in cool climate areas. Now, this is a wine at a price point, and I will leave a link in the notes below to the winesearcher webpage for this vintage so that you can see if it's available in your market, but also at what price it's available. And you'll see there it's not a particularly expensive wine. So my assumption is that like other brands in the Jacobs Creek Classic range, at least a proportion of the fruit for this comes from the warm inland flatland vineyards of places such as the Riverland and across the border into New South Wales and Victoria in the Murray-Darling region. However, given the fact that cool climate fruit is mentioned, it's probable that it's fruit from the Adelaide Hills, possibly from the Eden Valley, and possibly some of the other cooler areas within the Barossa region. And I think the winemakers are likely to be aiming for a sort of a broad spectrum of flavours here, wanting to pair some parcels of fruits giving broader tropical fruit flavours with less ripe ones that will contribute herbaceous or grassy notes. Now, Jacobs Creek are very open, in fact they're proud about the fact that they work with somewhere in the region of 120 different grape growers. They make the point that most of these are small family-owned companies, and they also make it clear that they have a viticulture team that work very closely with these suppliers to ensure the health of the vineyards and the quality of the fruit. And they're working with them throughout the season, not simply coming along at harvest and deciding when to pick. They will be involved in pruning decisions, in canopy management decisions, in those decisions that determine the yield. And Jacobs Creek put it that they see their growers as wine growers. In other words, that the wines are being formed in the vineyard. Jacobs Creek also make it clear, it's noted on the label, that they're committed to sustainable practices in winemaking. They give quite a lot of information about this. For instance, they've been trialling regenerative agriculture in 3.5 hectares of their vineyards. So this isn't necessarily across all their own vineyards, but for instance, they're utilising cover crops to try and improve the health of the soil and the availability of native insects within the vineyard. They've also been encouraging native plantings within their vineyard area and restoring an area of wetlands around Jacobs Creek itself. There are also other documented corporate commitments to sustainability, such as initiatives to reduce emissions and a commitment to use recyclable packaging, much as you'd expect, I think, from a major company exporting a brand like this worldwide. As for the 2025 vintage, I've seen this described as the driest, warmest and earliest in half a century in South Australia. There was a mild winter and a hotter than average spring, and then an exceptionally dry season followed on from record low levels of winter and spring rainfall. Yields were low to variable, certainly unsurprising given the fact there'd been drought conditions, but also ironically, given the generally warm vintage, there were problems with localised frost in 1 or 2 regions. For most, however, persistent heat and below average rainfall really compressed the harvest into a very short window, making this one of the fastest and hottest vintages for at least a decade. However, this all meant that the fruit that resulted had a good concentration of flavours. All this, however, was actually in the face of the fact that in 2025, national average rainfall across Australia was above average. Nonetheless, most of the south of the country had to endure these drought conditions. So the fruit for this wine, not surprisingly, is 100% Sauvignon Blanc. I would assume it's all machine harvested, and that machine harvesting will have gone on at night when temperatures have dropped below 15 degrees to ensure a retention of freshness, of aromas and good acidity in the wines. And if the fruit is in these cooler conditions, it reduces the instance of oxidation on the way to the winery. Following pressing, the juice will be settled to give a clean juice that then ferments in stainless steel tanks, with temperatures being controlled to slow the fermentation and help the retention of delicate fruit aromas. Now, for Sauvignon Blanc in general, certainly for this wine, malolactic conversion will have been blocked, both to maintain crispness in the acidity, but also to prevent any of the flavours that malolactic conversion would produce from obscuring the wine's fresh fruit. For similar reasons, the wine wasn't aged with its lees and was bottled young to preserve as much of its freshness as possible. The wine should be dry. It should, I believe, have less than 4 grams per litre of residual sugar, and to maintain its freshness and to prevent corktate, like the rest of the range, it's sealed with a Stelvin screw cap. Again, like the rest of the range, there is a note saying that this may contain traces of milk and egg, presumably used for fining. Having said that, that seems to be routinely mentioned on all the wines in the brand. And while I assume that may deter some vegetarian and vegan consumers from drinking the wine, I actually wonder if all the wines are routinely treated as that, or whether they simply use that labelling routinely for the whole range. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? Looking at it, it has a very pale yellow colour. There's quite a greenish tinge to it. Swelling it, the wine only has 12% alcohol. It is clinging to the glass, it's slowly forming tears. They're not particularly pronounced. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? There's quite a clear, clean, grassy, nettly note. Maybe some delicate hints of black currant leaf, passion fruit there. Perhaps there is a touch of underlying asparagus, all very classic aromas you'd expect to see on a Sauvignon Blanc. I think perhaps also a touch of maybe some slightly stony minerality. So that's for taste. The wine is certainly dry, it's crisp, it's fresh. There's a tartness to it that's almost of unripe apples. Certainly some citrus notes, maybe a hint of grapefruit. It's certainly making my mouth water. The wine is light-bodied, maybe verging towards light to medium. It's certainly not particularly full or rounded, and that 12% alcohol really doesn't stand out at all. On the palate, maybe the leaner, greener notes are showing a little more. There's a sort of a nettly note. That's followed by delicate asparagus hints. And while there is a little of that sort of classic tropical passion fruit note, that appears to be secondary to the more green fruit. I have to say, when I first opened the wine, there was a little more of a weight and concentration of tropical fruit evident on the palate, but it seems more as if it's the grassy, flinty notes that have developed and are showing more now. The finish is long and lean. There's a combination of mineral and citric crispness with a slightly grassy green edge. Now, when I first opened the wine, probably half an hour ago, I think I detected more of the tropical notes that I see here on the nose, but not so much on the palate now. And those are the notes that I'd relate more to a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. If anything, I think currently its style is a little more like a leaner, crisper wine that you might get from the Loire Valley. This is certainly not a wine that needs long aging. I think it is a wine that has shown me most of the characteristics I'm looking for in Sauvignon Blanc. It's very clearly representing the variety it's made from. And I do think it's a wine that's representing good value for money. In terms of its overall quality, when I looked at the winesearcher aggregated critic score, there, an agglomerated critic score of all the vintages gives it 85 out of 100. I think it's a little better than that. I think personally I'm scoring this 86 or 87. As I say, it represents the variety really well, and the lean finish is actually lasting very well. But it's not a wine of great complexity or enormous intensity. It's the sort of fresh, elegant wine that, drunk ice cold on a warm day, would make a delicious lunchtime wine or an aperitif for later in the day. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting, and I hope you've been following and been interested by my videos of the Jacobs Creek range. I've been quite impressed with the way the brand is providing value for money wines from classic varieties. So I have put together a playlist of the 6 wines I've looked at so far and a previous wine I've recorded, so that you can view them together and see what you think. If you're enjoying watching my videos, it would be fantastic if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would really help me to develop it further. If you have any comments or questions, please do pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. Maybe you have an experience of drinking Jacobs Creek wine that you would share. And certainly if you have any friends you think might like to watch, do please feel free to pass the link for this video on to them. So thank you once again for taking the time to join me, and I do hope that maybe you'll find some time in the near future and come and join me for another tasting. Till then, bye for now.